Okay, hello everyone. This is Ali Al Malham. We are Econ 500, Econ 2020, Principles of Macroeconomics, Section 500, CU Boulder. This is our first lecture that we're doing online. This is going to be chapter 17. We're talking about inflation. Before we get into it, let me give you some administrative updates. So this is how we're going to be doing lectures from now on. I'll be uploading recordings to Canvas, and you should be able to access them and watch them and rewatch them, um, and that's how we'll be doing lectures going forward. For office hours, we will have Zoom meetings. I'll send out links for those when office hours are, when we have the office hours. And yeah, you should come and ask me questions if you have them, and those will be our main way of talking, since you'll be watching lectures via recordings. For midterms, we're going to have them open book midterms. We have our next midterm after spring break, so in 2 weeks. And that will be as scheduled in the syllabus. And because things are now open book, there'll just be more questions than you usually see. So if last time was 25, and this time will probably be a little bit more than that. Okay, so that's it. That's all I have for administrative updates. Let's get into the chapter 17. So before we get into it, let me kind of motivate it a bit and show you a few images. The first one I have here is going to be of the currency from Zimbabwe. You can see it goes from 10, 50 to 10 million, 500 million, all the way up to 100 billion. And this is inflation at work. So it's either that like in this picture over here, we see that same currency, and that's how much you need to pay to get a loaf of bread. So we can look at inflation as in two ways. We can say that either the loaf of bread is extremely expensive in Zimbabwe, or the value of the money is very cheap in Zimbabwe, or the value of the money is very low. And those are two of the same things. Either prices are high or the value of money is low. And we can think of inflation as being both those things simultaneously, or which one you prefer. Either prices are very high or the value of the money is very, very low. We saw this example in Zimbabwe, or sorry, well, that was Zimbabwe. This is now in Venezuela. And because they've been going through some economic hardship now, the value of their money is very low, or inflation is quite high. One of the same thing. So that means that the price of toilet paper would be extremely high in Venezuela, because the Venezuelan currency has been devalued, or inflation has been rampant in Venezuela. And you can see some other examples here, like tomatoes, or even the chicken. So that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about inflation. How does this happen, and how can we avoid it, and why do we even have inflation at all? Okay, so let's go back to the slides. All right. So remember, why are we talking about this? Well, fundamentally, I said that the economy is constantly being hit by shocks. There are sometimes some bad things that happen to our economy, such as hurricanes, such as natural disasters, or maybe there's nothing bad and I just want to develop my economy and I just trying to grow it. Well, as government, I only have two tools. I have fiscal policy and monetary policy. Now, we said fiscal policy is going to be fundamentally spending, government spending. They collect some taxes, and the government can choose to spend those taxes in whatever which way they deem most appropriate, and that's fiscal policy. And the other part is going to be monetary policy, and monetary policy says, I'm going to influence the money supply. I'm going to influence the amount of money that's floating around in my economy. Either I'm going to increase or decrease the money supply. And if I do that, what I can do is that I can help heal certain parts of the economy that were affected, such as, and the example that we use is the East Coast being hit by a natural disaster, and I'm trying to rebuild the East Coast. Well, how can I do that? Well, if I can just inject a lot of money, if I can inject a lot of cash, if I can inject a lot of liquidity into the economy, then that money, that cash would naturally go to the East Coast and help rebuild it, because they're the ones that need it the most. or even if there's no natural disaster and I'm just trying to develop a certain sector in my economy, well, if I keep it flushed with cash, it has available financing, if it can find money easily to invest and do whatever startup or whatever investment they need to make, if that money is available, well, that is going to help growth and that's going to support the economy growing. And that's why money supply, as we shown here, is really, really important in monetary policy. And fundamentally, that's what monetary policy is trying to do, is trying to expand and contract the money supply in order to influence the economy. Now, if expanding the money supply leads to growth, then why don't we just grow it indefinitely? Why don't we just expand the money supply as much as we can and help grow our economy as much as possibly can? Well, that would be great, but that's a double-edged sword because money supply, if we expand the money supply, that affects inflation. And this is fundamentally what we're going to study today in this chapter, is saying that, well, if we expand the money supply too much, well, that's going to increase our inflation way too much, and then we end up being a Zimbabwe or a Venezuela type situation. So that's really what we're looking at, and then we're going to kind of understand how money supply affects real variables versus nominal variables. They affect them differently, and that's an important part called the classical dichotomy. We'll look at that, and then we'll kind of see what are the costs of inflation and who benefits and who loses. Okay. All right, well, first, before we get into inflation, let's talk about deflation. Deflation is going to be the opposite of inflation. So if inflation is going to be an increase in prices, well, deflation is going to be a decrease in prices. And we have had a deflationary period between 1880 and 1896, where prices were getting lower and lower. But generally, in most economies and in most of the times, we usually have inflation. And in the case of the US, we've had pretty low inflation over the past 10 years at around 1.52% per year. But we've had some times where inflation was quite high, particularly in the 1970s, where the US experienced a number of oil shocks, where prices of oil quadrupled or quintupled in a few months, and that contributed a lot to this high rate of inflation. So we do have some times where we have high rates of inflation, but on average, inflation is usually around 2 or 3% per year, with the last decade being a little bit lower than average. Okay, so here's inflation rates in 2018, 2.4% in US, 1.2 in Japan, 4.8 in Mexico, 12 in Nigeria, 15 in Turkey, 32 in Argentina. So you can see that inflation is usually low in well-developed economies that are generally performing well. But when you start to have inflation at 12, 15, and 13, 32%, well, that's an indicator that something's wrong. I don't think that any economy wants to experience such high inflation rates, because that's not really useful or beneficial for anyone, for most people in the economy. Look at Venezuela. We've had 1.4 million% inflation in Venezuela. So these are signs that, well, they're probably experiencing some economic distress. Something is going on in their economy that's causing this these high rates of inflation. And this is generally not good for people within the economy, because as you can see in the case of Argentina or in the case of Venezuela and Zimbabwe, you end up having to pay such high prices or have such a low value for your money, which is undesirable. So hyperinflation is going to be extraordinarily high rate of inflation, which is, like we've seen in Venezuela, 1.4 million% is clearly extraordinarily high. Okay, so fundamentally, we think about inflation as a function of how scarce is money. If money is very, very scarce, that means that not a lot of people have it, and it has a lot of value. Value coming from its scarcity. And classic examples of this is like diamonds and gold, because of they're naturally scarce and difficult to mine and difficult to come by. They have generally high values. So the more scarce something is, the more valuable it is. On the other hand, if something is widely available and not very scarce, and I have it, you have it, everybody has a little bit of this particular object or this thing, whether it's a good or whether it's a currency, right, a dollar. If the dollar is widely available and there's a lot of it, well, that means that it's not very valuable. And if something is not very valuable, that means that you need to fork over more of it to get the same amount, to get the same good that you would. So that means if money is not very valuable, prices rise. Prices rise why? Well, because the dollar that you're giving me is not very valuable. So you need to give me more of these dollars now in order to compensate me for that this dollar is pretty worthless. So we say that prices rise when governments print too much money. When governments print too much money, that means that there's a lot of cash floating around in the economy, and cash is not scarce. And if cash is not scarce, that means that it's not valuable, particularly, or less valuable than it was yesterday. And if it's less valuable, that means that prices rise. Prices rise because now you need to give me more of this less valuable money, and that's why prices are higher. So we rely on a theory developed by Milton Friedman called the quantity theory of money, and this helps explain um, uh, price level and the inflation rate, which is how quickly are prices changing in the economy. They're changing by 2%, 5%, 10%. So we need to make a difference between price level and the inflation rate, where price level is going to be what are prices today in this economy, and the inflation rate is going to be how quickly are those price levels changing from year to year. Okay. And we can think about this in two ways. We can think about it in a supply and demand diagram, which we'll look at in a minute, and we can also look at it through an equation. And both are useful in studying this type of dynamic. But again, fundamentally, prices rise when the governments print too much money. Okay? And this is coming from the fact that money is less valuable, and therefore we need to give more of these dollars in order to get the same good. And that's why prices rise, because we're giving more of these dollars out. Okay, so a few definitions. We just talked about the price level. So that's going to be how many dollars I need to fork over in order to get some good or services, or a basket of good or services. So when the price level rises, we have to pay more for the same basket of goods that I bought last year or last week. And the value of money is 1 over P. And that's going to be how valuable the dollar is. So you can think of, on the numerator, there's going to be a good, and that's going to be some goods that we can get per $1. And on the denominator is going to be that P, and that's going to be a price level. So we can think out the value of the money is that per $1, how many loaves of bread could I buy? All right, or per $1, how many units of this good can that purchase? And that's going to be the value of money, 1 over P. So a higher price level means a less value of money, because if the price level is high, that means the value of money is low, because you need to now fork over more of this cash in order to get the same goods. So a high level of P leads to a low level of 1 over P, which means low value of money. Okay, so where does money supply come from? Money supply comes from the Federal Reserve. They're the central bank of the U.S., and they're the ones who determine what should the money supply be. How many dollars are floating around in the economy? Do we want to increase the number of dollars or decrease the number of dollars, or maybe just keep them right where they are? So they decide the money supply, and they decide the money supply because they fundamentally control the printers, right? They can always print money if they need to, but then they also have a lot of reserves that they can use. So they already have a lot of cash on hand that they can use in order to increase or decrease money supply. So don't think that any changes in the money supply necessarily comes from printing more money. It can come from pre-existing cash that they're just holding on in their reserves. Money demand is coming from us, consumers, firms, both consumers and producers, but anyone that's not the government, that's choosing how much money to hold in our pockets, or how much money we want to hold in our checking account versus how much money we want to invest, say, for example. And the way that we think about it is, well, the higher the price level in the economy is quite high, then that means that I need to hold a lot of cash in my pocket in order to buy my groceries, in order to buy the stuff that I need to buy. And as a result, an increase in P makes me, or the more money I need, increases my demand for money. So if price level is high, then my demand for money is high. If price level is low, that means my demand for money is low. Why? Well, prices are low. I don't need a lot of cash in order to buy my goods and services, so I don't need to hold a lot of cash. So let's look at this in a graph. So here we have on the x-axis our quantity of money, And we have two y-axes here. We have on the right-hand side our price level, and that goes from, or let's look at the value of money. That goes from decreasing to increasing from low to high. So this is kind of how we think of our normal axis, increasing from 0 to half to 1. And over here, we're going to have the price level, which is going to be the inverse of this. So you can see that if that goes from something low all the way to high, meaning over here, the price level is low, things are cheap in the economy. And as things move in this direction, things get more and more expensive. So this is going to be a cheap price level. This is going to be an expensive price level. But you see that this is 1 over P, right? So if the price level here is 4, then the value of money is 1 over 4. The price level is 2, then the value of money is 1 over 2. The price level is 1, 1, because this is just 1 over P. And you can see that when the price level increases over here, goes from cheap to expensive, well, that just means that our value of money is going from high to low. When things are expensive and we live in a high price level environment, the value of our money is really, really low, which are two equivalent things, right? Something being expensive or your money being worthless are really two sides of the same coin. And that's why you can kind of look at these two things interchangeably. Okay, so yeah, this is what we've explained. As the value of money rises, the price level falls. So as we increase the value of money, if money is very, very valuable, then price level goes down because, well, I'm giving you these very valuable dollars and I don't need to give you a lot of them in order for you to give me some good or service because it's a high value money and that's why prices are low. So let's look at the supply equation. So the supply is vertical. It's saying that, well, the money supply is not a function of the price level or the value of money. This is saying that the money supply is completely determined by the government. It has nothing to do with what the price level is or what the value of money. At 1, half, 1/4, 4, 2, it doesn't matter where I am on the y-axis. Notice that all points will come to 1,000. It doesn't matter where I am. All of these points point to 1,000. That means that money supply does not change with P or 1 over P. And that means that the Fed determines what the money supply is, and they've determined today that it's $1,000. That's how much cash is floating around in our economy, and it's fixed at that number, regardless of what the price level or what the value of money is. Now, on the demand side, we're going to say that the demand side is the downward sloping curve. And this makes sense because, well, when the price level is really, really low, I don't demand to hold a lot of money because, well, prices are cheap. I don't need to carry these large amounts of cash in order for me to make my purchases. So my demand for money is low. Whereas if the price level was high and things were really, really expensive in my economy, well, that means that my demand for money will be high, or at least higher than what it was over here, because, well, prices are extremely high. I need to maybe fork over $1,000 or $1 million in order to just get a loaf of bread, so I better demand a high quantity of money because prices are expensive, all right? Now you can look at the inverse of this and say, well, when the value is very, very low, if the value of cash is low, well, you need to hold a lot of it to compensate for the fact that this cash is worthless, right? It's kind of like the Venezuelan and the Zimbabwe dollar. If the value of that, or Bolivar, which is a Venezuelan currency, if the value of the Bolivar is low, well, you need to carry a lot of Bolivars in order to buy a loaf of bread. Whereas if the value of the money was quite high, you see that your demand for money becomes low. You don't need to walk around with a lot of cash. The dollar is pretty strong. You just need to maybe walk around with $20 or $50 in your pocket, and then you can pretty much make whatever purchase you need to make. Okay? So this is how we think of these things. And then we do the intersection of our money supply and money demand curve, and what we get is going to be the equilibrium value of money and the equilibrium price level. Now notice, these two things are really the same thing, right? It's just P or 1 over P. So really we're determining just one number, and it's just, but the number can give us two stories. We can give us the price level, and it can give us the 1 over that, which is the value of the money, okay? All right. So how does monetary policy work? Well, we're going to say that the money supply was at $1,000, but now the Fed, because something bad has happened in the economy and they're trying to inject some cash, they're trying to inject liquidity, they're trying to increase the money supply. And if they increase the money supply, that may help solve the problem. But notice that by increasing the money supply, the value of money and the value of money decreases and the price level increases. So we move from point A to point B. And moving from point A to point B did two things. First of all, the prices went up. It used to be $2. Now it's $4. Of course, $2 per unit of this arbitrary kind of abstract good. But whatever we used to pay $2. Now we pay $4. Why did this happen? Well, it happened because we increased the supply of money. If the supply of money increased, that means that there's more cash out there. There's more money in my pocket. There's more money in your pocket. And as a result, we're bidding up the prices of goods and services. We feel more wealthy. We feel like we have more cash. We end up going out to the markets and we buy more of everything, right? Because we're all a little bit more wealthy. And as a result, we're pushing up prices from 2 to 4. The same story can be told on the value of money side, and we can say, well, because now we've gone from $1,000 to $2,000, the value of that money is less, right? It goes from a half to a quarter because, well, everyone now has more money. I have more money in my account, you have more money in your account, and as a result, money is less scarce. And if money is less scarce, that means it's less valuable. And that's why you have this decrease in the value of money. So you can think of these two stories all coming from an injection of cash. We just increase the money supply, that increases the price level because we're all a little bit more wealthy and we're kind of bidding up prices. But then also the value of money is less because, well, everyone has more money now. We've gone from 1,000 to 2,000. Money is less scarce, and the value of that cash has gone down. So here's the story saying that, hey, increasing money supply causes P to rise, and this is more or less what we've just gone over, okay? Okay, so this is fundamentally something called the quantity theory of money. This was created by Milton Friedman, and it says that, hey, the quantity of money available, which is essentially the money supply, that determines the price level, and the growth rate and the quantity of money determines the inflation rate. So what it's saying is that the increase in the money supply determines the price level, how much are people paying for stuff in our economy, or the growth rate in the quantity of money, right? Same thing, quantity of money saying, hey, determine the price level. This is saying the growth rate in the quantity of money, right? Not just the quantity of money, they're saying growth rate in the quantity of money determines the growth rate in the price level, which is the inflation rate. So this is saying that the actual level of money determines the price level. The growth rate in the quantity of money determines the growth rate in the price level, which is the inflation rate. So this is an important part of macro, is the classical dichotomy. And the classical dichotomy says that we should separate nominal and real variables. So what is nominal variables? Anything that's measured in monetary units and dollars. What is real variables? Well, those are the things that are measured in physical units. Remember, when I always talk about real GDP, I always talk about actual output, meaning quantities, meaning things that I can kind of tangibly touch and feel. Those are the things that we actually created in our economy, which is separate for how much we sold them for. Nominal variables is going to be how much we sold them for. Real variables is going to be how much did we produce. What is our Q, and this is what is our P. So we can think of, say, for example, nominal GDP versus real GDP, which is we just discussed. We can talk about the nominal interest rate. So that's going to be, how much interest you're making on an investment in nominal or in dollar figures or in dollar values. Okay. The real interest rate, as opposed to the nominal interest rate, is going to be measured in actual output, right? In actual things. So always, whenever you see the word real, you want to just replace dollars with actual output or actual objects. And then the last thing is going to be your nominal wage versus real wage. So you can think of nominal wage as going to be your contract. We know how much you're going to be paid per year. Maybe you get paid $80,000 per year. But your real wage is even more telling than that. Real wage can tell you, given that $80,000 that you're making, what can you buy with that? Can you buy an apartment? Can you buy a house? Can you buy how many houses, how many apartments, or how many cars? And that's a better way of measuring wage rather than just saying, well, hey, I'm making this large amount, but I live in a very expensive town, such as maybe San Francisco or New York, and as a result, your real wage becomes really, really low. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Okay, but these are two different things. You can measure your wage in dollar per hour or dollar per year, or you can measure your wage in how many things can I buy in a year, okay, or measured in output, or measured in units, or measured in quantities, same thing. Okay, so here we can talk about the relative price of goods, and this is going to be important when we talk about real changes in the economy. So let's say that we have a price of a smartphone, and that smartphone is $450, and we have a price of a pizza, and that's $10. We can figure out the relative price of a smartphone by just dividing the two prices on each other. We take the price of a smartphone, and that's going to be $450 per one smartphone. That's going to be our numerator in P. The denominator is going to be $10 per pizza, per one pizza, and that's going to be this price over here. If you divide those two and you kind of flip your units, the dollars cancel out and you get 45 pizzas per one smartphone. And that's pretty obvious because you can say, well, I can buy a smartphone for $450, or I can buy 45 pepperoni pizzas. And that's why you can think of this as an opportunity cost. We can look at the real wage, for example, and we can say, well, your real wage is going to be your nominal wage and divided by the price level. Okay, so we can say the real wage is going to be your nominal wage, W, your $15 per hour, divided by the price level, which is going to be the price of goods and services. So to calculate your real wage, we just need to divide these two numbers, and we get $15 per hour divided by $5 per unit output. So this is going to be my W, $15 an hour. That's your wage, divided by the price level. And how can you think of the price level here? You can try to think of, well, prices are going to be different in different places in the US. Prices are going to be extremely high in places like New York, San Francisco, big metropolitan cities like Chicago and LA. The price level is quite high in these areas. Whereas price levels are really, really low in more remote rural areas in the US, like say North Dakota or Wyoming or stuff like that. And even though you may be getting the same wage, say you sign a contract for $80,000 per year, but $80,000 per year can really give you two different lives, whether you live in New York or you live in Wyoming. If you live in New York, okay, you're getting paid $80,000 per year, but your real wage will be pretty low because the price level is going to be quite high. And as a result, the amount of goods and services that you can buy with your wage, with your $80,000 wage in New York, may not be that much. True that you're getting paid a lot, but what that actually translates to in a real perspective, in a actual goods and output and quantities perspective, may be quite low. Whereas if you take that same wage, $80,000 a year, and you move to Wyoming or North Dakota or somewhere where the price level is pretty low, then you're going to have a high real wage because the denominator is quite low. Things are very, very cheap in North Dakota, and that $80,000 wage can really buy a lot. You can buy a really nice apartment, maybe a house, maybe a car, things like that, things that you wouldn't be able to afford in New York or San Francisco or stuff like that. And that's a really important that's a really important way of looking at your real wage. How much is your purchasing power? It's another way to think of that, is purchasing power. With whatever wage you're making, what can you purchase with it? Can you purchase one Lamborghinis, two Lamborghini, three Lamborghinis, so on and so forth? And that's a kind of a better way of thinking of the wage part, or real wage. Okay, so there we go. 3 units of output per hour. Okay, so let's talk about the classical dichotomy, and we're going to say that if we can separate nominal and real variables, and by the way, this is what we've just been doing over here. We just said that this is a good way of looking at real prices. This relative price is a good way of looking at real prices. Now I've priced a smartphone, not in terms of dollars, but in terms of other real goods. So 45 pizzas per smartphone. That's a real price in a sense, a relative price, or a real price is same thing. And also here we figured out a real wage and said, hey, I've got some nominal wage, now I'm gonna get the real wage. And these are important real variables, okay? And now we're going to say that we want to separate these two. We know that there's a difference between nominal wages and real wages, and nominal prices and relative prices, which is real prices. And we're going to say that monetary developments, changes in the money supply, affect the nominal variables, but not the real. So that means that the changes in the money supply only affect one side of the economy. It only affects the nominal side of the economy, does not affect your real wage, or does not affect the relative prices. So let's see how that works. Okay. So this is part of that. So we're saying that, well, money is neutral. Money is neutral says that money supply does not affect real variables. And money supply does not affect real variables means that money supply only affects the nominal side. So let's take an example. We're going to say that we're going to double our money supply. And let's look at what happens to relative prices. So this is the same example that we saw earlier. And we're going to say that, well, it used to be that the price of a smartphone was $450 a smartphone. The price of a pizza was $10 a pizza, and we divided the two, and we got 445 pizzas per smartphone. This is the same result that we got last time. Now, if we double the money supply, that means that all prices will double. And if all prices double, and the price of a smartphone goes from 450 to 900, the price of a pizza goes from 10 to 20, you divide the two, and you still get the same real price or relative price. The same relative price has not changed. It's still 45 pizzas per smartphone. So here's the first example to show you that money supply has no effect on real variables. It has effect on nominal variables, and we saw that by going from 450 to 900 just by doubling the money supply. But the real price, 45, is unchanged. And this is kind of proving to you that changes in the money supply only affects nominal variables, none of the real variables. And the reason being is because, well, everything's kind of moving by the same amount. So relatively, nothing's changed. Let's look at another example. So you can think of, we're doubling the money supply again. So what happens to your real wage? Well, if we double the money supply, we know that prices are going to double, right? And prices are going to double because everyone has more money. If everyone has more money because of the increase in the money supply, then we kind of bid up prices, and we double the price level. But don't remember that just like there are prices of avocados and onions and milk in the market, there are also prices of labor. And that's essentially what we are. We are sold in the labor market, and we receive a wage, which is kind of like the price that you pay for goods or groceries or anything like that. And if the prices of goods and groceries have doubled, well, the same thing happens to labor. The price of labor also doubles. So that means that a doubling in the money supply, just like it leads to a doubling in the price level of goods and services, what also leads to a doubling in our nominal wages. And if our nominal wages double and the price level doubles, remember that real wage is just W over P, your nominal wage divided by the price level. And if this goes up by 2 and the denominator goes up by 2, then the real wage is unchanged. And the idea here is that, well, if we double the money supply and the price of milk doubles and the price of butter doubles, your wage has also doubled. So yeah, you're paying twice as much to buy these groceries of yours, but you're also getting paid twice as much from your employer. So nothing really changes with the amount of labor supplied or labor demanded because nothing real has really changed. And this is another example showing the neutrality of money, the fact that money supply does not affect real variables. It only affects nominal variables, right? So we'll actually see that there's going to be a difference here between the short term and the long term, but we'll leave that until later in the chapter. Oh, no, we're going to do it right now. Okay, so it turns out that this neutrality of money, or what we call the classical dichotomy. So the classical dichotomy is saying that money is neutral, Money is neutral is saying that money does not affect the real variables, okay? Only affects the nominal variable. But this is only true in the long run, okay? That means that money is neutral only in the long run. That means that money does not affect the real variables only in the long run. We will see that monetary changes in the money supply, can have short-run effects on real variables. And that's the essence of monetary policy. If this was not true, then there would be no point to do any monetary policy, because that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to affect real variables. Nominal variables are not very important. I'd like to change the actual output, the actual price levels in our economy on a real perspective, not just a nominal perspective. So the classical economy, or the neutrality of money, is only true in the long run. Money is neutral only in the long run. Money is not neutral in the short run, meaning that money can have an effect on real variables in the short run. And we'll see that in future chapters. And again, if this were not true, then monetary policy would be useless. Okay, so let's look at the quantity theory of money, and we're going to look at it in an algebraic way now. We're going to look at it a little different. So we're going to say that there's this equation, and this equation says M times V equals P times Y. And this is going to be the quantity theory of money. This is the formula that Milton Friedman came up with, and in fact, his license plate in California is MV space PY. But yeah, what is this saying? Well, first of all, we know a few things. We know that P is my price level, Y is my nominal GDP, okay? Or sorry, Y is my real GDP. So this Y over here is real GDP, this P is price level. That's real GDP, that's my Y, this is my P. And those two things multiplied is going to be my nominal GDP. How much stuff did we produce? What's our quantities? How many goods did we produce? Let's multiply that by the price of each good, and then we get our nominal GDP. Okay, that's how much money we made as an economy in a particular year or some time period. So that's going to be this right-hand side of the equation. And what this is saying is that, hey, nominal GDP, how many goods and services were sold and bought in an economy, if this is that right-hand side, well, that should also equal to the money supply, M, times V, which is velocity of money. And the velocity of money can be thought of how many times did money change hands, right? The rate at which money changes hands. If we only have $1,000 in our economy, then I need to figure out how many times did that $1,000 go from one person to another, and to figure out how many transactions were made in my economy. And to figure that out is to fundamentally figure out nominal GDP, P times Y. So these are two ways of calculating nominal GDP. I can do it the classical way, which is taking my quantity, multiplying by my price, and that's nominal GDP. Or I can figure out how much money is in the economy, how many times does that money change hands, right? How many times does that money transact, and on average in a year? And those two things multiplied by one another also gives me nominal GDP, and that's how we come up with this full equation. Well, if this is nominal GDP and that's nominal GDP, then MV must equal PY. And then from that, we can kind of rearrange to figure out what velocity is. The reason why I rearrange to get velocity is because everything over here is observable. I know what real GDP is. I know what the price level is. I know what the money supply is. Well, let me try to figure out the money or the velocity of money. That's not something that we can observe. We kind of estimate this V because we know what the money supply, what the real GDP, and what the price level is. Velocity has to be kind of backed out like this. Okay, so let's do an example. Let's say that there's only one good in the economy, and it's just pizza. And we're going to say in 2019, money supply was $10,000. Real GDP is 3,000 pizzas. Notice that GDP or real GDP is measured in output here, not measured in dollars. So we're saying that in 2019, this economy was able to produce 3,000 pizzas. And the price of each of those pizzas is going to be $10. What is the velocity of money? Well, so first of all, we know that real GDP is 3,000 pizzas. The price is 10, so I can immediately calculate my nominal GDP, P times Y. P times Y is going to equal my real GDP, the output that I produced, multiply it by the price, and we get 30,000, 3,000 times 10. Now I can calculate the velocity of money by just dividing by the money supply. I know I created $30,000 in worth of pizzas, but there's only $10,000 of money supply. So now we can figure out, well, how many times did this $10,000 need to trade hands, need to transact from one person to the other in order to get this nominal GDP, which we saw. So we divide our number, 30,000 divided by 10, that's going to be our money supply on the denominator here, and we get V equals 3. So V equals 3 says that on average, every year, a dollar moves from one person to the other 3 times. A dollar that starts off with me goes to him, goes to her, and goes to someone else, and finally settles at the end of the year. 3 times it changes hands. And that's why we can use this equation. Of course, fundamentally, all we've said is MV equals PY, and then we've rearranged to kind of solve for V. The average dollar was used in 3 transactions. Okay, so let's do, let us actually stop here, and we'll do this example next time for the next video. Thanks.